The setup. Jacob Lawson wasn't your average driver. At 29, he had already seen more danger in his young life than most people could imagine. As a federal investigator, Jacob had been given one of the most challenging assignments of his career: infiltrate a network of corrupt officers embedded within the city's police department. These officers had become notorious for their abuse of power, falsifying evidence, and targeting black citizens with unwarranted arrests. The department had received complaints for years, but without concrete evidence, the accusations seemed to fade away. Jacob was determined to change that, knowing that he could potentially save innocent lives and restore public trust. Months into his investigation, Jacob's covert work had brought him close to key individuals in the department. He had attended social events and gatherings, carefully building relationships without revealing his true identity. His quiet demeanor and reputation as a harmless nobody allowed him to slip under the radar, but Jacob knew that staying safe depended on him staying one step ahead. So, after a colleague's suggestion, he'd installed a hidden camera in his car. It was small, undetectable, and strategically placed to capture every angle. He'd also wired his dashboard to record audio, ensuring that even the slightest whisper would be preserved. One evening, as he was finally heading home after an exhausting day, Jacob noticed a car trailing behind him. Its headlights flashed briefly, and a sense of foreboding settled over him. His instincts told him this wasn't a random encounter. He glanced at his rearview mirror and spotted the familiar black and white police cruiser. Jacob's grip tightened on the steering wheel as the car behind him lit up its red and blue sirens, signaling him to pull over. A part of him had prepared for this moment, but he couldn't shake the unease creeping into his chest. Jacob took a deep breath, pulled his car to the side of the road, and quickly activated his hidden camera system. Every detail was about to be recorded, from the sound of the officers' footsteps to the expressions on their faces. He was alone on a dark stretch of road, the quiet eeriness only amplifying his heartbeat. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, but he also knew that every second of this encounter could be the evidence he needed to finally take down those abusing their power. The officer who approached his car was none other than Rick Thompson, one of the primary suspects in the investigation. Rick was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a reputation for intimidation. His partner, Officer Kyle Brooks, followed closely, scanning the surroundings. Jacob kept his hands visible, resting them on the steering wheel as he waited for Rick to reach his window. He noticed a flicker of recognition in Rick's eyes, an unsettling glint that hinted this was no routine stop. "Evening, officer," Jacob greeted, keeping his tone calm and respectful. Rick smirked, his eyes narrowing. "License and registration," he barked, his tone far from polite. Jacob nodded, carefully reaching for his documents, conscious of every movement he made. He'd heard too many stories of traffic stops turning deadly over a sudden movement. As he handed over his paperwork, he noticed Rick's scrutinizing stare, an unnerving blend of malice and curiosity. This wasn't just a traffic stop, it was something far more sinister. Rick studied the license, then looked back at Jacob. "Been drinking tonight?" he asked, though it was clear he wasn't asking out of genuine concern. "No, sir," Jacob replied, his voice even. He kept his eyes trained on Rick, observing every flicker of expression. The camera was catching everything: the tension, the aggressive posture, the looming figure of Kyle in the background. Rick leaned down, peering into the car. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle?" he asked, a faint sneer tugging at the corners of his mouth. Jacob knew that if he refused, the situation could escalate quickly. He took another steadying breath, mentally reminding himself that his best weapon right now was his calm composure. He opened the door and stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate. Once he was standing outside, Rick motioned for him to place his hands on the hood of the car. Jacob complied, feeling the cool metal beneath his palms. Kyle moved in closer, his gaze hard and unyielding. The two officers exchanged a glance, one that spoke volumes. "Let's see what we have here," Rick muttered, nodding to Kyle, who began a search of the car. Jacob kept his head down, his heart pounding as he heard Kyle rummaging through his belongings. The officers didn't have a warrant, and he hadn't been informed of any violation, yet they proceeded with a thorough, invasive search. Jacob's fists clenched involuntarily as he felt the injustice of the moment weigh down on him. But he stayed silent, allowing the hidden camera to capture every second, every unjust act, every fabricated accusation they were about to make. After a few minutes, Kyle's voice rang out, laced with a feigned surprise. Well, what do we have here?" He held up a small plastic bag, its contents unmistakable, a powdery substance Jacob knew hadn't been in his car. Jacob's stomach twisted, a mix of anger and fear surging through him. He watched as Rick's eyes lit up, the triumphant look of a predator who had ensnared his prey. "Looks like you're in some trouble, Mr. Lawson," Rick said, the smirk on his face widening. He was relishing every second of this, knowing that the discovery would lead to an arrest and potentially destroy Jacob's reputation. Keeping his expression neutral, Jacob spoke up, his tone steady. "I don't know where that came from, officer. I don't do drugs." Rick's smile faded for a moment, replaced by a flash of annoyance. "That's what they all say," he scoffed, slipping the handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for possession of illegal substances." As Rick reached to cuff him, Jacob made his move. "Before you proceed, officer, I should inform you that my car is equipped with a recording device. Everything that's happened here tonight is on tape." The impact of his words was immediate. Rick's confident smirk faltered, his eyes widening in shock. Kyle, who had been rifling through Jacob's glove compartment, froze, his expression shifting from smug to panicked. "What did you say?" Rick demanded, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. Jacob met his gaze, calm but unyielding. "There's a camera in my car, Officer Thompson. It's been recording this entire interaction, including the moment you found that baggie under my seat." For a moment, there was silence. Then Rick's face twisted in fury. He glanced at Kyle, whose eyes darted nervously from Jacob to Rick, clearly unnerved. They hadn't anticipated this. They thought they could manipulate the situation, that they could control the narrative. But now the power dynamic had shifted. Kyle muttered something under his breath, his gaze flicking to the patrol car parked behind them. "What do we do?" he whispered, the panic evident in his voice. Rick hesitated, his mind racing. The plan had been to frame Jacob, to teach him a lesson, but this new development had caught them off guard. He glanced back at Jacob, his eyes narrowing with barely concealed rage. "We'll see about that," he growled, trying to regain his composure, but his voice lacked the previous confidence. Jacob stood still, watching the two men unravel, their bravado crumbling in the face of their own deceit. He knew that the next few moments could determine the outcome of his investigation. He had expected intimidation, perhaps even fabricated charges, but the extent of their actions still left him deeply disturbed. The system was supposed to protect people like him, not target them. But as he stared at Rick and Kyle, he realized just how deeply entrenched the corruption ran. His calm demeanor seemed to unnerve the officers even more. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Rick spat, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. But Jacob didn't respond. He simply held the officer's gaze, knowing that his silence would speak louder than words. This was only the beginning, and Jacob was prepared to see it through. Unraveling intentions. Jacob remained outwardly composed as the officer's confidence faltered. His heart raced, not just from the adrenaline of the moment, but from the knowledge that he was finally peeling back the layers of corruption that had plagued the community for years. Rick Thompson and Kyle Brooks were just two of many within the department rumored to use their positions for intimidation and worse. But tonight, thanks to his covert preparation, the tables had turned. Rick's face was a mask of fury, his jaw clenched tightly as he struggled to regain control of the situation. His partner, Kyle, looked visibly shaken, darting nervous glances between Jacob and Rick, clearly uncertain of what to do next. The silence stretched uncomfortably as both officers realized they were caught in a trap of their own making. Rick took a deep breath, his nostrils flaring as he tried to gather his composure. He glanced around, as if to ensure there were no other witnesses. "So, you think you're going to play smart with us, huh?" he sneered, though his voice was laced with desperation. Jacob held his ground. He didn't need to respond. He knew that every word the officers uttered would only serve as further evidence against them. The silence was his weapon, forcing Rick and Kyle to confront the reality that their actions were being recorded. Kyle's voice was barely a whisper as he turned to Rick, panic etched on his face. "We should leave, Rick. This isn't worth it." Rick shot him a venomous look, frustration bubbling over. "Shut up, Kyle," he snapped. "We're in control here." But deep down, even Rick knew that wasn't true anymore. The weight of Jacob's unwavering gaze, coupled with the knowledge that everything was being documented, pressed down on him like a vice. For the first time in his career, Rick felt cornered. Desperate to turn the situation around, Rick changed tactics. He straightened his posture and softened his tone, trying to appear reasonable. "Listen," he said, addressing Jacob in a forced calm. "There's no need to make this more complicated than it is. We can handle this right here, without dragging things out. Just turn off the recording, and we can go our separate ways." Jacob raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "Why would I turn off the recording, officer? I was under the impression that I was being detained for suspicious activity. Isn't that what you said?" The corner of Rick's mouth twitched, and Jacob could see the gears turning in his mind, grasping at ways to control the narrative. But Jacob remained calm, his silence speaking volumes. He wasn't going to give them an inch. Kyle, who was clearly less seasoned in handling situations that spiraled out of control, began to shift uneasily on his feet. His fingers twitched as he stuffed his hands into his pockets, his eyes avoiding Jacob's as guilt started to eat away at his bravado. Rick, however, wasn't one to back down easily. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low growl. "You may think you're smart, kid, but you don't know who you're messing with. This little stunt isn't going to end well for you. We've got friends in high places. You won't be able to hide behind a camera forever." Jacob knew this was a last-ditch attempt to intimidate him, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he held Rick's gaze, letting the officer see that he wasn't afraid. In fact, he was counting on Rick's arrogance to dig him even deeper into the hole he was already in. Without another word, Jacob took a small step back, creating a bit of space between himself and Rick. "Am I free to go, or am I still being detained?" he asked, his voice calm and steady. The question seemed to throw Rick off balance. He glanced at Kyle, who looked as if he wanted to melt into the pavement. The silence stretched on as Rick grappled with his options, his confidence slowly unraveling. Finally he scowled, knowing that he was backed into a corner. "For now," Rick muttered through clenched teeth, "but don't think this is over." Jacob didn't respond. He knew the game they were playing, and he was ready to take it to the next level. He returned to his car, his heart still pounding, but his resolve stronger than ever. As he started the engine and pulled away, he couldn't help but feel a small surge of satisfaction. Rick and Kyle may have walked away tonight, but their actions had been recorded in every detail. They had planted evidence, attempted to intimidate him, and threatened him. All of it was documented, and all of it would come to light. As he drove home, Jacob's mind raced with possibilities. He knew he would have to be careful, that he couldn't confront them directly without jeopardizing his mission. But he also knew that he wasn't alone in his fight. His supervisor, Agent Susan Potol, had been overseeing the investigation from the beginning, offering him both guidance and support. Susan had seen the impact of corruption firsthand, and she was determined to dismantle it, no matter the cost. Once he reached home, Jacob locked his doors and checked his surveillance equipment. He transferred the video files from a hidden camera to a secure server, ensuring that even if something happened to him, the evidence would be preserved. He reviewed the footage, watching as Rick and Kyle's faces twisted with anger, frustration, and finally fear. Every second of their aggression was crystal clear, from Rick's sneering threats to Kyle's visible anxiety. This was the ammunition he needed to expose them. The next day, Jacob met with Susan at a small, unassuming cafe on the outskirts of town. She was a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. She listened intently as Jacob recounted the previous night's events, nodding occasionally but remaining silent until he finished. "Good work, Jacob," she said finally, her voice calm but laced with determination. "This is exactly the kind of evidence we need. It's time to turn up the heat on them, but we'll need more. We can't just rely on one incident, no matter how incriminating. If we're going to bring them down, we'll need a pattern, a consistent record of their behavior." Jacob nodded, understanding the gravity of her words. One video was powerful, but it might not be enough to dismantle the network of corruption that had taken root within the department. He would have to endure more encounters, gather more evidence, and bide his time until he had an undeniable case. Susan leaned forward, her expression intense. "We'll set up additional surveillance, maybe even wiretap their patrol car if we can get authorization. This will require patience, and I know it won't be easy. But if anyone can do it, it's you." Jacob felt a surge of gratitude for her trust in him. "I'm ready, Susan," he replied. "Whatever it takes, I'm in." She nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Then let's get to work. But remember, Jacob, your safety is our top priority. Don't take unnecessary risks. If anything feels wrong, you call it in immediately." Jacob promised he would, though he knew deep down that the path ahead would be fraught with danger. He had chosen this life, chosen to face corruption head-on, knowing that his actions could make a difference. But he was acutely aware of the risks. The police department wasn't just any institution. It was a powerful entity with resources and influence. The men he was targeting wouldn't go down without a fight. In the weeks that followed, Jacob continued to document his interactions with Rick and Kyle. They pulled him over again, on different pretexts, each time pushing the boundaries of legality. They searched his car without warrants, made vague threats, and tried to provoke him. But Jacob never rose to the bait. He remained calm, polite, and unflinching, letting the camera capture their every move. He began to notice a pattern. Rick was the more aggressive of the two, quick to anger and prone to making rash decisions. Kyle, on the other hand, was more reserved, almost reluctant, as if he were being dragged along against his will. Jacob realized that Kyle might be the weak link, the one most likely to break under pressure. If he could find a way to reach him, to make him see the consequences of his actions, it might create an opportunity to fracture their partnership. One evening, during another staged traffic stop, Jacob decided to test this theory. As Rick searched his car, muttering insults under his breath, Jacob caught Kyle's eye and held his gaze. For a moment, Kyle hesitated, his expression softening just enough to reveal a flicker of doubt. "Do you really think this is right, Officer Brooks?" Jacob asked, his voice low but steady. "Is this what you signed up for?" Kyle looked away, a hint of shame crossing his face. But before he could respond, Rick barked, "Shut up, Lawson. You're in no position to ask questions." Jacob knew he couldn't push further without risking a confrontation, but he had seen enough to confirm his suspicions. Kyle was vulnerable, conflicted, perhaps even regretful. If he could exploit that weakness, it might be the key to unraveling the entire scheme. As he drove away that night, Jacob felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was inching closer to the truth, step by careful step. The evidence was building, the cracks in the officer's facade beginning to show. It was only a matter of time before the weight of their own corruption would bring them down. And Jacob would be there, watching, waiting, ready to expose them to the world. Cracks in the shield. Jacob's investigation had entered a new phase. Each time he encountered officers Rick Thompson and Kyle Brooks, he gathered more evidence, patiently adding to the case he was building. But he knew that he couldn't wait forever. The stakes were high, and every encounter with these officers risked his cover and potentially his life. He needed to strike a balance, push forward with his mission without tipping them off or provoking them into something he couldn't control. One late night, after his latest run-in with the corrupt officers, Jacob sat in his dimly lit apartment, reviewing footage from his car's hidden camera. He watched as Rick's face twisted in frustration, his anger barely concealed behind a thin veil of professionalism. And there, just behind Rick, was Kyle. The younger officer's gaze was a mix of reluctance and unease, as if he were on the verge of breaking free from Rick's influence, but lacked the courage to do so. Jacob rewound the footage, zooming in on Kyle's expression. He noted the subtle shifts in his demeanor, the way his eyes would dart away, the tension in his posture. It was clear that Kyle wasn't as hardened or corrupt as Rick. Jacob saw a vulnerability there, a conscience struggling against the toxic influence of his partner. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If he could get through to Kyle, convince him to come forward, the entire investigation could shift. Kyle could be the key to unraveling the corruption in the department from the inside. But Jacob knew this would require careful planning. Approaching Kyle directly would be risky. He had to find a way to reach him without raising suspicion. The next morning, Jacob met with his supervisor, Agent Susan Potol, to discuss his observations. The cafe where they met had become a safe haven, a place where they could speak freely without the risk of eavesdropping. "Susan," Jacob began, sliding his laptop across the table so she could see the footage. "I think Kyle Brooks is our way in. He's reluctant, maybe even uncomfortable with what they're doing. If we could persuade him to cooperate." Susan studied the footage, her sharp eyes narrowing as she analyzed Kyle's expressions. "Interesting," she murmured. "I see what you mean. He doesn't have the same conviction as Rick. He looks hesitant, almost guilty." Jacob nodded. "I think he's in over his head. He probably joined the force with good intentions, but got caught up with the wrong crowd. If we can reach him, we might be able to convince him to turn on Rick and expose the others involved." Susan leaned back, considering their options. "It's risky, Jacob. If Kyle tips Rick off, this whole operation could be compromised. But I agree, this could be our best chance. We'll need to approach him carefully. Do you think he's open to a direct confrontation?" Jacob shook his head. "Not yet. He's still under Rick's influence, but I think a subtle approach might work. If I can create a situation where he feels cornered, where he has no choice but to confront his own role in all this, he might break." Susan tapped her fingers thoughtfully against her coffee cup. "All right, let's set up a scenario. I'll arrange for a few undercover agents to observe from a distance. If anything goes wrong, they'll intervene. But Jacob, remember, don't push him too hard. We don't want him running back to Rick and blowing the entire operation." Jacob agreed, feeling the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. This was his mission, but it was also a delicate balancing act. One wrong move, and months of hard work would be undone. The following week, Jacob put his plan into action. He drove through the city, knowing that his movements were being monitored by Rick and Kyle, who had made it a habit to trail him whenever he was out. He drove aimlessly, making random turns and stops, knowing that they would eventually approach him if he appeared suspicious enough. Sure enough, after half an hour, the familiar flash of blue and red lights filled his rearview mirror. Jacob pulled over, his heart pounding as he prepared himself for the encounter. He activated his hidden camera, making sure that every angle was covered. Rick approached the car first, his usual scowl plastered on his face. "You just can't keep yourself out of trouble, can you, Lawson?" he sneered. Jacob forced a calm smile. "Good evening, Officer Thompson. Is there a problem?" Rick's gaze hardened, and he motioned for Jacob to step out of the car. "Out of the vehicle. We're going to have another little chat." Jacob complied, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. As he stepped out, he noticed Kyle standing a few feet away, his expression guarded. This was the moment Jacob had been waiting for, a chance to confront Kyle in a way that would make him question his actions. As Rick began his usual aggressive search of Jacob's car, Jacob turned to Kyle. "Officer Brooks," he said quietly, "do you ever wonder if this is really what you signed up for?" Kyle stiffened, casting a wary glance at Rick, who was too absorbed in his search to notice. "I don't know what you're talking about," Kyle replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Jacob took a small step closer, his tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to do this, you have a choice." Kyle's eyes darted around nervously, as if searching for an escape. "Look, man, I'm just doing my job," he muttered, but there was a crack in his voice, a hint of uncertainty. Jacob pressed on, his voice steady. "Is this really what you wanted when you joined the force? To be part of something like this?" Kyle looked away, his jaw tightening as he fought back his own doubts. Jacob could see the inner turmoil etched on his face, the struggle between loyalty to his partner and his own sense of right and wrong. For a brief moment, Kyle's gaze softened, and Jacob thought he might actually reach him. But before he could say anything more, Rick emerged from the car, his face twisted in frustration. "Nothing here," he grumbled, glaring at Jacob. "But don't think this is over, Lawson. We'll catch you slipping one of these days." Jacob met his gaze, unfazed. "Is that so, Officer Thompson?" Rick took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Watch yourself, Lawson. People like you don't belong here. Sooner or later, you're going to mess up, and when you do, we'll be right there waiting." Jacob didn't flinch. Instead, he held Rick's gaze, letting the officer see that he wasn't intimidated. "I think you'll find that I'm exactly where I belong, officer, and I'm not going anywhere." Rick's eyes flashed with anger, but he held his tongue. He motioned for Kyle to follow him back to the patrol car, muttering under his breath. Kyle hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Jacob, his expression conflicted. As they drove away, Jacob watched them go, feeling a mixture of hope and frustration. He knew he had planted a seed of doubt in Kyle's mind, but he also knew that it might not be enough. Breaking free from someone like Rick wouldn't be easy, especially for someone as young and inexperienced as Kyle. Later that evening, Jacob reviewed the footage from his car, studying every interaction, every subtle shift in Kyle's demeanor. The doubt was there, simmering beneath the surface, but doubt alone wouldn't be enough to turn him. Jacob needed to create a situation where Kyle would have no choice but to confront his own actions, to see firsthand the consequences of his complicity. Days turned into weeks, and Jacob continued his mission, collecting more evidence, enduring more encounters with Rick and Kyle. Each time, he would look for small opportunities to reach Kyle, to remind him of his conscience. But Kyle remained distant, trapped in Rick's shadow, unable or unwilling to break free. One afternoon, Jacob received a call from Susan. "We've made some progress on the surveillance," she informed him. "One of our undercover agents managed to intercept a conversation between Rick and a higher-ranking officer. It seems they're feeling the pressure from your investigation. They're getting sloppy, making mistakes." Jacob's pulse quickened. What kind of mistakes? Rick was overheard discussing a plan to plant more evidence, not just on you, but on several other individuals they've targeted. It's an organized scheme, one that goes higher than we initially thought. Jacob's mind raced as he absorbed this information. The corruption ran deeper than just a few rogue officers. It was a network, a coordinated effort to exploit the very people they were sworn to protect. And Kyle was caught in the middle, a pawn in a game he might not fully understand. Susan's voice grew serious. "Jacob, we need to act fast. If we can get Kyle to cooperate, to testify against Rick and the others, it could blow this entire operation wide open. But it's risky. Are you up for it?" Jacob didn't hesitate. "I'm ready. I'll reach him, Susan. I know I can." As he ended the call, Jacob felt a renewed sense of purpose. He was close, closer than ever to exposing the truth, and he knew that Kyle was the key to unlocking the entire case. He would find a way to reach him, to show him the path forward, even if it meant risking everything. The final showdown was approaching, and Jacob was prepared to face it head-on. He had come too far to turn back now. The city deserved justice, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The breaking point. The operation was reaching a critical point, and Jacob could feel the weight of it pressing on his shoulders. He had been working tirelessly for months, enduring harassment, threats, and intimidation at the hands of Rick and his network. And yet, he'd never felt closer to his goal. The system of corruption he was uncovering was larger and more intricate than he had initially realized, spanning across multiple officers, supervisors, and even city officials who had been turning a blind eye in exchange for favors and bribes. The only way to bring it all crashing down was to reach Kyle, the one officer who still seemed to carry a shred of conscience. Jacob had been pushing, prodding, planting seeds of doubt, but it wasn't enough. He needed a definitive moment, a catalyst that would force Kyle to confront the truth and decide which side of the line he wanted to stand on. Jacob sat down with his supervisor, Agent Susan Potol, to discuss his next steps. They met in a quiet park on the outskirts of the city, away from prying eyes. Susan had come armed with additional intelligence, including recent surveillance footage and intercepted conversations between Rick and his superiors. The corruption extended higher than they'd anticipated, but Susan had managed to piece together enough evidence to expose at least part of the network. "We're getting close, Jacob," she said, handing him a folder filled with confidential documents. "But we need something undeniable, something that will turn public opinion and force the department's hand. We need a witness from the inside. Kyle is our best chance." Jacob nodded, flipping through the documents. Among them was a transcript of a conversation between Rick and his supervisor. They discussed setting up more cases by planting drugs on unsuspecting drivers, using the fabricated charges to extort money or favors. It was sickening, and it only fueled Jacob's determination. Susan continued, "We'll create a situation, something that will force Kyle to see the consequences of his actions. If we can stage a scenario where he sees the impact of this corruption firsthand, we might be able to push him to make a choice." Jacob understood her plan. Kyle had been a passive participant, following orders without question. But if he were forced to witness the harm caused by those orders, he might finally see the truth. It was a risky strategy, but it was their best shot. The following evening, Jacob put the plan into action. He arranged to meet with a young man named Marcus, a local community advocate who had been working to expose police misconduct in the neighborhood. Marcus had agreed to participate in a staged encounter with Rick and Kyle, where he would act as a vulnerable citizen pulled over for a minor traffic violation. Susan's team would be monitoring from a distance, ready to intervene if things went south. Marcus was a smart, charismatic individual, respected in the community for his dedication to justice. He had been targeted by the corrupt officers before, so his involvement wouldn't raise suspicion. The plan was for Marcus to subtly provoke Rick, enough to get under his skin, but not enough to incite violence. They hoped this would force Kyle to confront Rick's excessive actions and realize the harm they were causing to innocent people. Jacob parked a few blocks away from the prearranged location, monitoring the scene through a small surveillance feed connected to his phone. His heart raced as he watched Marcus sit in his car, waiting for Rick and Kyle's patrol car to pull him over. Susan's team was strategically positioned nearby, ready to document every moment. Jacob took a deep breath, steadying himself. He was placing a lot of faith in Kyle, hoping that this would be the moment that pushed him over the edge. The patrol car eventually pulled up behind Marcus, its red and blue lights flashing ominously. Rick stepped out first, his familiar scowl darkening his face as he approached Marcus's window. Kyle trailed behind, his posture rigid and tense, as if he were bracing himself for what was to come. "Evening," Rick drawled, leaning down to look at Marcus. "License and registration." Marcus handed over his documents, keeping his expression calm and respectful. "Is there a reason I'm being pulled over, officer?" Rick's eyes narrowed. "You got a problem with following orders." Marcus kept his cool. "Not at all, officer. Just asking a question. Am I under suspicion for something?" Rick sneered, glancing over his shoulder at Kyle, who stood a few steps behind, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Suspicion? You could say that. We're just doing our job. keeping the streets safe. Kyle shifted uneasily, his gaze flickering between Rick and Marcus. Jacob could see the tension in Kyle's posture, the way he clenched his fists as he listened to Rick's taunts. Kyle looked as though he wanted to say something, but the weight of his loyalty to Rick and the fear of retribution kept him silent. Rick, sensing Kyle's hesitation, smirked and leaned closer to Marcus. "You seem awfully nervous, son. Got anything you shouldn't have in this car?" Marcus, maintaining his composure, replied, "I'm just a community organizer, officer. I don't have anything illegal on me." Rick raised an eyebrow, then turned to Kyle. "Search the car, Brooks." Kyle hesitated, glancing at Marcus, who sat still, his expression a mix of defiance and quiet resolve. Jacob held his breath, watching the live feed as Kyle took a step forward, then stopped, clearly struggling with his conscience. Rick, are you sure we need to do this?" Kyle asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rick shot him a sharp look. "Since when do you question me, Brooks? We're doing our job. Or would you rather let this guy go so he can continue whatever illegal nonsense he's up to?" Kyle swallowed hard, his face pale. Jacob could see the conflict in his eyes, the flicker of doubt that Rick's words failed to extinguish. Kyle knew that Marcus wasn't a criminal, that this was just another excuse for Rick to harass someone he perceived as a threat. But fear kept him silent, his loyalty to Rick clouding his judgment. Marcus sensed the hesitation and seized the moment. "Officer Brooks," he said, his voice steady, "do you really think this is what policing is about? Stopping people who are just trying to live their lives?" Kyle's eyes met Marcus's, and for a brief moment, Jacob saw a crack in his facade. But Rick, determined to maintain control, barked, "Enough with the lecture. Brooks, search the damn car." With a resigned expression, Kyle reluctantly began to search the vehicle, his movements robotic and mechanical. It was clear that he was going through the motions, doing as he was told without fully engaging. Jacob's heart sank as he watched Kyle comply, but he knew this wasn't the end. Kyle's doubt was growing, and that was enough for now. After a fruitless search, Rick grew visibly frustrated. He muttered under his breath, clearly irritated by the lack of incriminating evidence. "Guess you're lucky this time," he snarled, handing Marcus's documents back with a dismissive sneer. "But don't get too comfortable. We'll be watching." Marcus held Rick's gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "I appreciate the concern, officer, but I don't have anything to hide." Rick's face twisted in anger, but he restrained himself, glancing at Kyle as if to say, "We'll deal with this later." He motioned for Kyle to follow him back to the patrol car, and they drove off, leaving Marcus alone on the roadside. Jacob exhaled, a mixture of relief and frustration coursing through him. The encounter had been tense, but it hadn't gone as far as he'd hoped. Kyle's hesitation was a start, but it wasn't enough to push him into action. Jacob needed more, something that would force Kyle to choose a side once and for all. Later that night, Susan debriefed Jacob, analyzing the footage and discussing their next steps. "Kyle's conflicted, but he's still not ready to break away," she observed. "We need something stronger, something that will shatter his loyalty to Rick." Jacob nodded, his mind racing. Maybe it's not just about witnessing the harm. Maybe Kyle needs to feel it, needs to experience the consequences firsthand. Susan looked intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" Jacob's plan was audacious, even dangerous, but he knew it might be the only way to reach Kyle. What if we stage an incident where Kyle is forced to take the fall for Rick's actions? Something that will make him realize that his loyalty to Rick is a one-way street, that Rick won't hesitate to throw him under the bus if it suits him. Susan considered this, her expression thoughtful. "It's risky. If Kyle doesn't react the way we hope, it could backfire." "I know," Jacob replied, determination hardening his gaze. "But I believe Kyle has a conscience buried under all that fear and loyalty. We just have to force him to confront it." Susan agreed, though she reminded him to be cautious. One wrong move, Jacob, and this whole operation could come crashing down. Be careful. Over the next few days, Jacob put his plan into motion. He coordinated with Susan's team to arrange a carefully controlled encounter. This time, they would place Kyle in a position where he would have no choice but to confront the truth or face the consequences. The stage was set, the trap laid. Now it was a matter of watching, waiting, and hoping that Kyle would finally see the light. Jacob knew that this could be the breakthrough they needed, the moment that would turn the tide. But he also knew that if it failed, the fallout would be severe for both him and Kyle. The breaking point was near, and there was no turning back. Betrayal unmasked. The tension in the city had been building like a slow-rolling storm. Jacob knew that tonight would be critical. Either he'd succeed in flipping Kyle to his side, or he'd risk losing the one inside connection who could bring the entire operation crashing down. The plan was carefully constructed, meticulously thought through, and yet every step came with a heavy sense of risk. He was about to force Kyle into a situation that would test his loyalties, shake his beliefs, and hopefully open his eyes to the betrayal lurking within his own department. The plan was simple in theory but intricate in execution. Susan had arranged for another agent to play the role of an unsuspecting citizen, someone they would set up as a supposed criminal in possession of contraband. The setup was designed to look like a sting operation gone wrong, one where Rick would panic and Kyle would be left to take the fall. Jacob knew that Rick's loyalty only extended as far as his own interests. When things got rough, Rick wouldn't hesitate to throw Kyle under the bus to save himself. As the night drew on, Jacob sat in his car, a few blocks away from the designated meeting spot, his nerves on edge. His phone buzzed, a text from Susan. "Susan, they're en route. Our agent is in place. We're live." Jacob took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel as he watched the screen on his phone, which displayed a live feed from the hidden cameras they had set up around the area. This wasn't just a test for Kyle, it was a test for the entire operation. One slip-up, one miscalculation, and their months of work could be exposed. He watched as Rick and Kyle's patrol car pulled up to an empty warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a location frequently used by the Department for Controlled Operations. Rick had convinced Kyle that they were conducting a raid on a supposed drug dealer who was allegedly trafficking substances in the area. Unbeknownst to Kyle, the only dealer present tonight was an undercover agent carrying nothing but planted evidence designed to incriminate the officers involved. Jacob's heart pounded as he saw the two officers step out of their car. Rick was all swagger and confidence, his smirk widening as he spotted their target lingering near the side entrance of the warehouse. Kyle, on the other hand, looked tense and uncertain, glancing around as if sensing that something wasn't quite right. "Stay sharp, Brooks," Rick muttered, his voice low and dripping with condescension. "Don't screw this up." Kyle swallowed, nodding stiffly. Jacob could see the doubt flicker across his face as he followed Rick toward the suspect. This was it, the moment when the plan would either succeed or implode. Rick approached their undercover agent, a man posing as a low-level dealer named Ray, with all the confidence of someone who had done this countless times. "Evening, Ray," he said, his voice a mix of false friendliness and menace. "Got something for us tonight?" Ray played his part perfectly, shifting nervously and mumbling about a shipment he was supposed to deliver. Rick's eyes gleamed with predatory delight, sensing an opportunity. He turned to Kyle with a smirk. "Go ahead, Brooks. Check him out." Kyle hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but he did as he was told, patting Ray down and finding the bag of planted drugs in his pocket. His face tightened, a flash of surprise crossing his eyes as he held up the evidence. Jacob could tell that Kyle hadn't expected this. He hadn't anticipated actually finding anything, and his surprise betrayed his lingering innocence. Rick, however, was in his element. He gave Ray a cold smile, taking the bag from Kyle and holding it up triumphantly. "Looks like we've got ourselves a little entrepreneur here," he sneered. "Too bad your business is about to be shut down." Ray shifted uncomfortably, playing his part to perfection. I don't know what you're talking about, man. That's not mine. Rick chuckled, clearly relishing the power he held. Tell it to the judge. You're done here. He turned to Kyle, his tone suddenly serious. Cuff him, Brooks. Kyle looked down at the cuffs in his hands, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. He glanced at Ray, who was putting up just enough resistance to appear credible, without actually fighting back. Jacob could see the turmoil in Kyle's eyes, the uncertainty, the discomfort. It was as if he were finally starting to see the cracks in Rick's facade. As Kyle reached out to place the cuffs on Ray, Rick suddenly stepped back, his face contorting with mock surprise. Wait a minute, he said, raising his hands theatrically. Looks like someone forgot to check their pockets. He reached into Kyle's jacket pocket, pulling out a small bag identical to the one he'd planted on Ray. Jacob's stomach churned as he realized what was happening. Rick had planted evidence on Kyle. Kyle's face went pale, his eyes widening in horror as he stared at the bag in Rick's hand. What? What is this? He stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Rick's smirk was cold and calculating. Looks like you've been holding out on us, Brooks, he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. You know, this doesn't look good. Not good at all. Kyle took a step back, his hands shaking. Rick, this isn't mine. I don't know how that got there. Rick shrugged, feigning innocence. Sure. I'm sure you just forgot about it. But you know what? The department's not going to see it that way. They're going to see a rookie cop caught with illegal substances. You know what that means, don't you, Kyle? Kyle's face twisted in panic, the full weight of Rick's betrayal crashing down on him. No, this isn't right. You set me up. You put that in my pocket. Rick laughed, his tone mocking and cruel. Oh, come on, Brooks. You really think anyone's going to believe you over me? I'm a respected officer with years of service. You're just a rookie, a nobody. You think the department's going to take your word over mine? Jacob watched, his heart pounding as Kyle's world crumbled before his eyes. The betrayal was complete, the disillusionment searing through him as he realized that Rick had never seen him as a partner, only as a pawn, someone to be discarded the moment he became inconvenient. Kyle took a shaky breath, his fists clenched as he struggled to contain his anger and fear. You can't do this, Rick. This isn't right. I trusted you. Rick's expression hardened, his smirk fading into a look of cold disdain. Welcome to the real world, Brooks. Trust doesn't mean a damn thing out here. It's every man for himself. The silence that followed was thick with tension, and Jacob could see the transformation happening in Kyle's eyes. The naive loyalty he'd held for Rick was gone, replaced by a steely resolve, a determination born from betrayal and a desire for justice. At that moment, Susan's team made their move. 2 undercover agents stepped out from the shadows, their badges flashing as they approached. Rick's eyes widened in shock as he realized what was happening. What the hell is this? He snarled, his confidence suddenly replaced by panic. One of the agents addressed Rick with a tone of cold authority. Officer Thompson, we've been monitoring your activities for some time now. You're under investigation for corruption, abuse of power, and tampering with evidence. Rick's face drained of color, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. This is a setup. You can't do this. The agent ignored him, turning to Kyle. Officer Brooks, we have reason to believe you were unaware of the full extent of Officer Thompson's activities. If you cooperate with our investigation, we may be able to offer you leniency. Kyle's face was a mixture of relief and shame. He looked at Rick, the man he had once respected, now exposed as a fraud, a manipulator. The weight of his complicity pressed down on him, but the offer of redemption shone like a beacon in the darkness. With a trembling voice, Kyle spoke, his words carrying the weight of his betrayal. I'll cooperate. I didn't know it was this bad. I just wanted to do my job. I didn't sign up for this. Rick, realizing he had lost his grip, snarled at Kyle, his voice venomous. You're nothing but a coward, Brooks. You think they'll protect you. They'll throw you to the wolves just like they're doing to me. Kyle's gaze was steady, resolute. Maybe, but at least I'll be doing the right thing. As the agents led Rick away, Jacob felt a sense of vindication wash over him. He had finally succeeded in breaking through to Kyle, forcing him to confront the darkness within the department. It hadn't been easy, and the journey was far from over, but they had taken the first step toward exposing the corruption that had infected the city. Kyle turned to Jacob, his face a mixture of gratitude and regret. "I'm sorry, Jacob. I should have listened sooner. I just didn't want to believe it." Jacob placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "The important thing is that you're here now, Kyle. We have a chance to make this right. Together." Kyle nodded, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. He had been broken, but in that breaking he had found his purpose, a commitment to justice that could not be shaken. With Jacob by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. The road to redemption was long, but for the first time, Kyle knew he was on the right path, and as he walked away from the shadows of his past, he vowed never to look back. Justice in the light. The courtroom was packed. Spectators, journalists, activists, and families of those who had suffered from police corruption filled every seat and lined the walls. The case had gripped the city, turning into a symbol of the long-standing fight for justice against a system plagued with unchecked power. This wasn't just a trial of two corrupt officers. It was a reckoning, an opportunity to cleanse an institution that had betrayed the trust of the very people it was meant to protect. At the heart of the proceedings sat Jacob Lawson, calm yet resolute. The weight of months of undercover work, surveillance, and meticulous planning now rested on his shoulders. He had gathered evidence that left no room for denial. Hours of video, recorded conversations, and testimonies from victims and witnesses who had once feared speaking out. But the cornerstone of his case was Kyle Brooks, the officer whose journey from complicit bystander to courageous whistleblower had transformed the trial into a powerful, emotional battle for redemption. As the judge called the court to order, Jacob glanced at Kyle, who sat next to him at the witness stand. Kyle's face was pale but determined, his hands resting on the Bible as he prepared to testify against Rick Thompson and the web of corruption that had trapped him for so long. This was his moment to make things right, to atone for the choices he had made under Rick's influence. The prosecutor rose, her voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, we're here today to shed light on a series of egregious violations of public trust committed by certain members of the police force. The evidence we present will show a disturbing pattern of abuse, deception, and betrayal carried out under the guise of law enforcement." She turned to Kyle, her gaze firm yet supportive. "Officer Brooks, please tell the court about your experiences with Officer Rick Thompson and your role in these incidents." Kyle took a deep breath, his voice shaky but resolute as he began. "I joined the police force because I wanted to make a difference, to help people. I believed in justice, in protecting the innocent. But over time, I found myself surrounded by officers who didn't see things the same way. They saw their power as a tool for control, for intimidation. And I became part of it, even though I knew it was wrong." He glanced at Jacob, drawing strength from his presence. "Officer Thompson was the one who showed me the darker side of this job. At first, I thought it was just his way of handling things, that maybe he was just more hardened by experience. But it was more than that. He saw people, especially black citizens, not as individuals to protect, but as threats to control." The courtroom was silent, every eye on Kyle as he laid bare the corruption he had once been a part of. He continued, his voice growing stronger. "I stood by and watched him plant evidence, manipulate situations, even threaten people. I told myself I was just following orders, but deep down, I knew that was a lie. I didn't want to face the truth, that I was helping him destroy innocent lives." The prosecutor nodded, encouraging him to continue. "Can you tell the court about the night when you and Officer Thompson pulled over Jacob Lawson?" Kyle's face tightened as he recalled the events of that night. "We had been tailing Jacob for weeks, looking for any excuse to pull him over. Rick wanted to make him an example, to show the rest of the neighborhood what would happen if they questioned us. That night, we pulled him over under false pretenses. I could see that he was calm, that he knew exactly what was going on. But Rick was determined. He planted drugs in Jacob's car, even though he knew Jacob was innocent. The prosecutor turned to Jacob, who nodded in confirmation. Then she returned her focus to Kyle. "And did you participate in this act?" Kyle hesitated, shame clouding his eyes. I did. I stood by and let it happen. I didn't speak up, didn't stop him. I was scared, afraid of what would happen to me if I went against Rick." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Kyle's words sank in. The judge rapped his gavel to restore order, his face stern but contemplative. The weight of Kyle's confession was undeniable, the honesty of his remorse apparent. The prosecutor continued, her voice unwavering. "Officer Brooks, at what point did you decide that enough was enough?" Kyle looked down, his shoulders slumping. "It was when Rick turned on me. I realized then that loyalty meant nothing to him, that he would destroy anyone who got in his way, even his own partner. That's when I understood that if I continued to follow him, I'd lose myself completely. And then Jacob reached out to me. He gave me a way out, a way to make things right." The prosecutor turned to the judge, her expression resolute. "Your Honor, the prosecution has presented overwhelming evidence, not only of Officer Thompson's actions, but of a pattern of corruption that has infected this department. With Officer Brooks' testimony and the evidence gathered by Investigator Lawson, we believe we have built a case that will bring justice to the victims of these abuses." The defense attorney, a man known for his ability to manipulate narratives in favor of his high-profile clients, rose with a smug smile. "Your Honor, while the prosecution has certainly put on a good show, I would remind the court that Officer Thompson is an experienced police officer with an exemplary record. This case is nothing more than a smear campaign orchestrated by a few disgruntled individuals with personal vendettas." He turned to Jacob, his eyes narrowing. "Mr. Lawson, isn't it true that you were personally involved in altercations with Officer Thompson prior to this investigation?" Jacob met the defense attorney's gaze, unflinching. "Yes, we had encounters, but that's precisely why I began gathering evidence. I witnessed firsthand the abuse of power that he and others were committing." The defense attorney smirked, turning to address the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to consider the possibility that Mr. Lawson, with his personal grievances, might be exaggerating these events. After all, his word against an esteemed officer like Officer Thompson's should be taken with a grain of salt." But the jury was watching Kyle, not the attorney. They had seen the pain in his eyes, heard the tremor in his voice. The truth was plain to see, woven into the sincerity of his confession. The defense attorney's words hung in the air, hollow and ineffectual. The prosecutor rose again, her voice ringing with conviction. "Your Honor, we have video footage, audio recordings, and the testimony of multiple victims who suffered at the hands of these officers. This is not a case of personal vendetta. This is a case of justice, long overdue." As the prosecution rested, Jacob felt a surge of hope. They had presented an irrefutable case, one that exposed not just Rick, but the entire web of corruption that had festered within the department. The city was watching, the media broadcasting every word, every revelation. For once, the voices of the victims were louder than the defenses of the powerful. After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The judge's voice was solemn as he addressed the courtroom. "In the matter of Officer Rick Thompson, we find the defendant guilty on all counts, including abuse of power, tampering with evidence, and conspiracy to commit fraud." The courtroom erupted, cheers mixing with tears as the weight of justice finally settled over the room. Rick's face was a mask of fury and disbelief as officers led him away in handcuffs, his legacy shattered, his reputation destroyed. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Jacob turned to Kyle, who sat silently, tears streaming down his face. He looked up at Jacob, a mixture of relief and regret in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't deserve forgiveness, but thank you for helping me see the truth." Jacob placed a hand on his shoulder, his voice steady. "It's not about forgiveness, Kyle. It's about doing what's right, no matter how long it takes. You have a chance to rebuild, to start fresh. Use it." Kyle nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. He had a long road ahead, but he was ready to face it. He had seen the darkness, lived within it, and now he was ready to fight against it. In the weeks that followed, the city erupted with calls for reform. Protests, rallies, and public discussions fueled a movement for transparency and accountability within the police force. Jacob's case had ignited a fire that could not be extinguished, sparking new policies, oversight committees, and a complete overhaul of the department's leadership. The community, once silent and fearful, now stood together, their voices united in the pursuit of justice. Jacob continued his work, but this time he wasn't alone. Kyle, having left the force, joined him in his mission, dedicating his life to advocating for police reform and fighting for the rights of the vulnerable. Together, they traveled from neighborhood to neighborhood, sharing their story, encouraging others to stand up against corruption and hold those in power accountable. The journey had changed them both, transforming their pain into purpose. They had faced betrayal, injustice, and unimaginable darkness, but in the end, they had emerged stronger, united by a shared commitment to truth. And as Jacob looked out at the crowd during one of their community events, he felt a profound sense of hope. He had fought for justice, for redemption, and for a future where no one would have to fear those sworn to protect them. It had been a long and arduous battle, but it was one he knew was worth every sacrifice. For in the end, justice had not only prevailed, it had inspired a city, united a community, and changed lives. And that, Jacob knew, was a legacy that would endure long after he was gone.